Do you know what replacement theology is? It is the opinion on the part of some Christians, historically and even in the present, that the Church of Jesus Christ essentially replaces the Jewish people in the plan of God. It basically holds that Israel is no longer an important part of God's end-time plan. Replacement theology holds that only the church matters, therefore the Old Testament is not really important to read, study, or follow, and all references to God's people going forward apply only to Christians. Even many of the church fathers were in effect anti-Semitic, such as Martin Luther. It is not my intent to debunk replacement theology here. The New Testament certainly does not teach that God is finished with his people Israel, and there are plenty of references to Jewish people in the end times in the writings of Paul and John, to include Revelation. So you can research all that for yourself if you want my take. Replacement theology is hogwash. The Jews were, are, and will be a central part of God's program. The rest of us are blessed to also be a part of his plan because we are spiritually grafted into them if we trust in our Messiah, Yeshua, Jesus. The covenants and oracles of God were all given to the Jewish people, and we must be spiritually grafted in to be part of God's eternal plan. This is available to all people by their choice. No one is excluded. The intent of this article is to take a look at exactly how much the Jewish people and Hebrew/Jewish Old Testament ideas are and will be important as we go forward. Even a cursory reading of the prophets such as Zechariah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel cause one to realize how important Israel and the Jewish people will be in the end times. There are chapters upon chapters describing a revived Israel and God himself ruling from the land of Israel during a 1,000-year period. The Bible essentially tells us that Israel will be the center of life on earth as we approach eternity. The borders will be expanded, and there will be a requirement for all nations to send delegations to Israel annually at the Feast of Tabernacles. Nations not complying will have their rain stopped. See Book of Zechariah. What brings all this to mind for me is even more mind-blowing. Reading in Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48, we see the building of a huge and glorious temple in Jerusalem during the 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth, aka the Millennium. Did you know that there will be sacrifices? There will be sin offerings and burnt offerings, etc. There will be priests and princes and all the activities once outlined in the Torah several thousand years ago under the Mosaic law. I thought to myself, how can this be? Why do we need sacrifices again since Jesus died for our sins once and for all? Why do we need priests and temples? This seems most unusual to the informed Christian who believes the gospel that Jesus died for our sins once for all, and that he is the final and only sacrifice for sin. There are many other questions, but that one takes the cake in my book. Let's take a look. Since I became fascinated with this apparent dilemma, I have studied what many scholars say and have seen several opinions. Before we begin, please know that the detail about the temple and the rituals I described is enormous in Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48. It is therefore very unlikely that this is all merely symbolic. These are clearly literal descriptions shown to Ezekiel by a heavenly messenger regarding a new temple with sacrifices and rituals. And this vision all took place about 573 BC after the destruction of Solomon's temple in 586 BC by Nebuchadnezzar, while Ezekiel and others were captives in Babylon. Please note also that the second temple, was in fact built in Israel shortly after this vision by the returning deportees that looks nothing like the temple described in Ezekiel. So, what are some of the opinions about this? Some say that this vision was a general symbolic vision of a glorious temple representing good days ahead for Israel, who would return to the land from Babylon. Based upon the great detail which is described, most commentators find this very unlikely. This is especially true in light of other biblical passages in the prophetic books mentioned before that lend support to a grand scenario of Israel's eventual condition. Others hold that the vision was of a glorious temple that was to be rebuilt upon the return from Babylon, but was never quite rebuilt to the standards of the Ezekiel passages. So perhaps the builders fell short of the mark, so to speak. The temple that was rebuilt was not nearly as glorious even as Solomon's temple, and when the older people saw it, many of them cried, presumably due to the comparison with that first temple. Again, if this vision was given by God to Ezekiel, I find it very unlikely that it would not come to pass as described. If God ordains something, it will occur. Although it may pose some challenges to standard Christian theology, many, like me, hold that Ezekiel's temple will be built most likely in the millennium after the tribulation and Christ's return. It will be huge and glorious with streams of living water coming out from it. There will be priests, sacrifices, and princes. Say what? Why sin sacrifices? Here is what I think. No doubt, the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross was once for all. It is in fact the only thing that provides forgiveness and therefore salvation to us all who will place their trust in him. Let there be no mistake and no equivocation about that. There is no other sacrifice that forgives sin. In fact, in the Old Testament, no one ever said the blood of bulls and goats would save you. As the author of Hebrews says, these sacrifices never did, never can, and will never save. They were only pictures of the propitiating sacrifice of Jesus, which truly washes away sins for those who believe. The animal sacrifices were merely atonement or covering, a ritual that represented what was really going on in heavenly places by our eternal high priest, Jesus. Therefore, some say that the millennial future sacrifices will be memorials looking back at what Christ did. This is possible, but I think there is more to the story. We may be learning about how God really operates until the eternal kingdom, when there is a new heaven and a new earth with no temple, when God the Father will dwell therein. It very simply appears there is a necessity for God to have a temple where his presence will dwell. The Bible does tell us that for believers, our bodies are also his temple. But from the beginning, after sin entered the world, if God was to dwell with us, he required a temple. And to minister to him, the priests needed to ceremonially cleanse themselves and ceremonially offer sacrifices for their sin. That's the way it was, and that is the way it looks like it will be again. A new wrinkle in my brain.